Hey, how are you? This is John. Thanks so much for joining me for this video and for being a patron. This video is going to detail the weathering of the Gundam Bael. It's going to be I hope I can get it all in one episode. I never know when I start filming if I'll be able to get it in under about a half-hour time limit. So that's the plan. My overall plan for the weathering is actually to do kind of a Star Wars universe style weathering, where if you look at, especially in the original, what I call pure movies, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, the style was generally to weather the colored areas in terms of chipping, but not so much along the white areas. So I'm going to be doing more chipping to the blue areas to suggest that this is paint over a white base. And I will be doing some chipping on the white, but my goal in this is not so I do want to have chipping, but I want to use the chipping to suggest edge highlighting. To kind of feature the shape of the model, because when you're working with, especially with white, I mean it can be any color, but when you're working with white, it can be really hard to pick out at a normal viewing distance the shape and design of a mobile suit. So I thought just by adding some chipping here and there to the white, just to suggest the shape, and it's going to be very light. At least that's the plan. And then just do heavier on the blue, because that will suggest weathering. And then I'm going to go in and do some staining and some streaking. But I want it to be a weathered look, but I don't want it to be beat up. It's always a challenge for me because I tend to like weathering, and I like heavy weathering. So sometimes I can get a little carried away, so we'll see how that works out. But that's the goal of the weathering plan for this model. All right, I want to just speak a little bit to the mechanics of the process. I've tried weathering models both fully assembled like this and completely apart. I like to do my initial stages of weathering, the chipping, the basic staining, that kind of thing, with the model disassembled, because it's easier to get to a lot of those points. I think there's value in, towards the end of the weathering process, to put everything back together so that you get to see it as one organic unit, and kind of make sure that everything is looking cohesive. But I'm of the opinion that disassembling the model partially into, shoulder pieces, arm pieces, legs, I'll show you in a moment, I think that has some benefit just for ease of handling, because these move around, because they articulate, the more you move them around, the more chance you have to scrape paint. And that's not always a good thing. So I like to pull it apart, avoid the scraping of paint, makes it easier to access things. And then when I get it to a certain point where I need to be more concerned with the overall look of the entire thing, then I can bring it back together, do some touch-ups in the previous work if needed, and then start doing the work that kind of pulls it all together as one cohesive whole. So let me get this disassembled, and I'll show you the parts that I'm going to be working on. All right, I have everything disassembled, and this demonstrates one of the reasons I love these 1/100 scale iron-blooded orphan kits. Because the armor is the assembly of the inner frame and the putting on of the outer armor are two distinct sections of assembly. When you pull them apart like this, they're just perfect for it. You don't have to account for taking apart the model. You just remove the limbs, and you get these nice sections to work on. Not every 1/100 scale, or any Gunpla for that matter, is this nice in terms of partial disassembly for work purposes. But you see the parts I have. It gives me access to all of the edges. I left the waist unit attached to the torso simply because just the design of the suit gives me good access to all of the areas that I want to be able to work on. In some cases, when you're building Gunpla, you may want to remove the torso and the waist, but there's enough separation and distinction here that I'm able to do that. So with that step done, I'll move on to weathering proper. All right, to start the chipping, I'm going to demonstrate on this part here. There's not a lot of chipping to do on the blue areas because there's not that many blue areas on the model. So I thought this would be a fairly large, good piece to demonstrate on. Now, the beauty of the snap fit nature of Gunpla means that I can chip this off the model, which gives me really great access to the edges. Now, I'll be using white to chip, and I'm not too worried about if white did get on here, but the white I'm going to be using, this part was painted in Mr. Color, Gundam Color MS White. And I'm going to be using Vallejo Model Color Cold White for the chipping. There's a little bit of difference. When it's on the blue and next to the white, it will look fine. I've used it before and it looks good. This is a little different though than this, so I want to avoid getting too much on the white just because I don't want it to show too much. But let me get a spot of that in my palette and a couple of other things ready, and I'll show you what I do here. Okay, I've got my cold white paint in the palette, unthinned my part, a piece of sponge in my little tweezers here, my clamp, and I've got a piece of paper towel. And you've seen me, if you've watched any of my videos, you've seen this before, and you've probably seen plenty of other people do it. The paint is distinct enough from the paper towel that I can get an idea of what the pattern is, but you can always, on something like this, you can always just flip the part over and see what kind of pattern you're getting. That looks good to me. Now, I'm not going to try and necessarily get every edge, but what I want to do is just at some of the key points suggest chipping, like down at the bottom where there's a transition, along here to give a little bit, right up here at the top, maybe on this corner. In some places I like to decide, okay, for whatever reason that's going to be heavy, and I'll give it a heavy application right there. And see, having it off the model lets me get along the edge there. I'll do some here, and I'm going to get just some general chipping along the face of it. And then, because I'm not going for too heavy a chipped look, that'll work. Now, if you want to get some in one of these panels, but you only want it on one side of the panel line, there's a little trick that not a trick, but it's fairly obvious once you see me do it. But let me get some things together and I'll show you how I handle that. First, I get a piece of Tamiya tape, do some detacking, because I don't want it to, these lacquer paints are very durable that I use, but I don't want it to lift. I'll put that on there. Use a toothpick to burnish along the panel line so you can see it well. Use your number 11 blade to cut along the panel line. Use the tip of the knife to lift up the tape. And now we've got that section isolated. Once it's isolated, I just chip it like I would anything else. And it's up to you whether you want it heavy or light, all around or just in a particular area. I've decided I'm going to make this a little heavier down at the bottom for whatever reason. Something happened to it, and we'll say that it got chipped there. And I'll do it again there. And when I'm done, I can lift it off. And we just got a couple of neat edges that help bring that out. Okay, with that reassembled, you can see how that's going to look. I like how that's turned out. And I'll go around and do the same process on the other blue parts on the mobile suit, and then we'll move on to chipping the white. I'll use this same piece for demonstrating the white chipping, just because it has plenty of good edges and things for reference. Now, anytime I'm doing chipping, I always like to think of the logic of what's happening if this were a real object. Now, I've already established that by the chipping, this suggests that this originally started off as a white part that was painted blue. So it's chipped down to white. Your story logic doesn't necessarily have to be consistent with the real world, just consistent with itself sometimes. So I wanted it to show, so I'm going to say this is chipped down to white. This, I'm going to make the assumption, is painted over some kind of composite material. If you want it to suggest something metal, something that oxidizes, you would probably want to use a brown color, a chipping brown color like this Vallejo Mecha color. But because I want to suggest some kind of composite underneath, something that doesn't rust, I want to choose between Vallejo black gray or neutral gray. I like grays for suggesting composites because in the experience I've had with composite armor, it always tended to be some kind of dark gray. So in thinking of the two of these, the darker one would certainly be more stark and stand out. But that starkness is going to make the chips, it's going to exaggerate the chips a little bit. If that's the effect that you want, then use it. I want a little lighter of a look. I want to be able to chip maybe a little more, but not have it look necessarily so heavy. So I'm going to go with neutral gray. Now, I could go with a lighter gray. The problem with a lighter gray is at a normal viewing distance, it's often just lost to the eye. These mass expanses of white parts will, I guess you'd say, blow out the eye a little bit. The eye gets a little saturated with white. So seeing that a light gray here would be a little difficult. So I think the neutral gray is a good balance of not too dark, allowing me to put a few more chips on there, but it won't be so stark that it appears super heavy like a dark gray would. At least that's my logic, so I'm going with it. Okay, I have my neutral gray loaded in the palette. I've got a new piece of sponge. You can flip over a piece of sponge, but sponge is so cheap, I like using a new piece for each color. In fact, I keep a little jar of sponges standing by all the time, so I've got that to work with whenever I need to. But I'm going to take this sponge, I'm going to take my piece of paper towel that I used before, and here I'm going to work on the same theory. I'm not going to be necessarily trying to chip where the chips might appear logically, but rather I'm going to make them, or I'm going to add them onto the model in places just to help establish outlines, to help break up. Like right along here is where I'm going to want to go a little heavier, because this is a raised surface off of this, and I want to make sure that there's a good distinction right there that the eye can latch onto to see this is distinct from this. Same way over here. I'm just going to add some right there to give some distinction. Now down here I'll do a little, and I'll do a little there, just for some general surface chipping. But I'm not going too heavy. I want it to be just enough to help the viewer understand what's going on the mobile suit. One thing you can do to get into tighter areas or areas where you really want to focus on something, like there's a little ridge right here. You get you a larger brush like that, and you get one side of it wet with paint. It's probably a little too much paint, but that's okay. And you dab that off just like you would with a sponge, but now you can take just that edge and dab it right up against that. And now we've got a nice sharp line right along that edge to make it stand out, but there's not a lot of chips either side. And you can do a little bit of sponge chipping on that to establish a little randomness up and down it, and then this will make the whole thing stand out just like I did there. So this can also be a very good tool for doing that. And don't forget, you can also do the masking that I showed earlier if you want to make any area really stand out. So I'll continue doing this not only on this part but on the rest of the mobile suit, and I'll show you what that looks like when it's finished. Okay, I've got the chipping done on all the parts. I'm going to continue working for now on this demonstrator piece. And the next thing I want to do is introduce some staining and some grime that is going to suggest fluid leaks and dirt and just whatever may come along. And this will, I'm going to continue the process of not only suggesting that kind of weathering, that kind of damage, but it's also going to try and enhance the various shapes of the models so that they stand out a little more. So let me get everything together and I'll show you how I'm going to proceed with that. All right, what I've got is a bit of ammo of MIG Oil Brushers Starship Filth. Here it is, and I know they say that these things are really neat, but I'm starting to get a bunch of gunkle on the lid here. But anyway, I've got the Starship Filth here. I'm not using the brush that comes in the lid because it's a little bigger than I want and I want a little more control, so I just put some oil down here. I've got some odorless thinner here to work with in a moment. Now, one of the things you absolutely have to be careful of is when you're using odorless thinner around Bandai plastic. You have to use it in very light amounts. I'm going to show you how I do that, but be aware that if it gets into, say, an unpainted or unprimed joint or somewhere not on the surface, it can shatter the plastic. I've had that happen on another IBO kit. There was a part that hinged like that, and there was a little peg here, and inside it hadn't been primed, and I was doing some weathering along where the hinge line was, and some of the thinner got in there, and literally within about a minute I went to move it like that, and the little moving part inside just shattered into about 5 pieces. Now I was able to pull it all apart, glue it back together, and it worked fine, but you have to be very careful, and if you're not comfortable with doing it, I would suggest using acrylic products, weathering powders, something that's not potentially going to damage the plastic. But all that said, I start off with this, it's a cheap narrow brush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some of this oil and I want to just paint it along here, and I'm doing a fairly heavy line right along there because I just want that to be a bit shadowy and grimy. This process, when I deal with oils and stuff, I think of it as shoving them around, because that's what you do in a lot of ways, and here's what I mean by that. I damp my brush, or I tip my brush in the thinner, and then I wipe off most of it. That way there's nothing flowing into the plastic. And then I go in and I just kind of bounce along that edge. Now this blends them around a bit, and I'll clean off my brush every now and then. But you'll notice you get a fairly stark line right there. Let me move that up so you can see that. See how that has, it's essentially pulled it away from the crack, and that's fine, because now what I do is I go back, and this is what I'm talking about, shoving oils around. I push it back in. And if you're not, if you want to get more of the oil off, you redamp your brush and just continue pushing that back in. And the beauty of oils is they have such a long working time that you can really fine-tune the look of how you want something to be. Now I want that part to be fairly grimy and really accentuate the shadow. So I'm just going to keep pushing it back like that. But now, you see, that doesn't look half bad. Which I guess implies it doesn't look half good either, but I can live with it. Now let me do this other side here. And again, I'm just kind of blending it around. And because I put less oil over there, it wasn't a deliberate move. It just happened to be that I put less. I'm just going to live with that. Everything doesn't have to be symmetric and even all the time. But what you end up with is a nice, distinct line for this blue piece. And again, people can see the distinction between the blue and the white. So, I mean, we've already got that there. But this will really go a long way to giving that piece depth and dimension. Because when you see shadow, it suggests depth, it suggests weight, it suggests volume. So there's that piece. All right, a couple of other areas that I wanted to show, similar to what I was just showing on the wing part. I want to make sure that this separation here has good volume to it. So again, I'm going to take my brush, but I'm going to do a little heavier application. The beauty of oils is, among many things, is if you get too much, you can just take a Q-tip, a cotton bud, and start wiping them off. Now you can see there, there's a lot of shadow there because of all the oil I put on. But I do that same process that I just showed. I simply take the, well, camera there, yeah. I take it and I start pushing back at it, blending it a little bit. And be patient when you're working with oils. It's real easy to get it to a point that you think, man, that just looks like a horrible mess. But that's actually not a bad thing, because what it means is you're on your way to looking cool. And you'll notice that I just continually, I'm not actually re-wetting with thinners. I'm cleaning the brush as I work. You can re-wet, I guess you'd say, but more of what I'm doing is pulling some of that oil off to get it to the level of shadow and grime that I want. Now you see, if you're working and you think that's the level I want it at, then you leave it. But you can come along, move down along that line, see how I'm doing that? And just clean off some, just like that, and then continue blending. So it's a very customizable way of introducing grime and shadow and stuff like that. And that gets it like I want it. And the cool thing with oils is I can come back in a couple of hours, and if I'm not happy with that, I can adjust it again. Another thing to show, this mechanical piece up here, I'm going to make the assumption that there's going to be a lot of grime there. So I'll make my line here, and I'll eventually end up doing it all the way around. I'm just going to show this one edge right here. I'm going to make my grime there, start it off, and I'm going to get my old brush here, and I'm not going to dip it in thinner this time. I'm just going to dry it off. It doesn't have to be completely dry, but I'm just going to start pulling it down like that. Even up here, because the oil and grease is going to flow down. And if you have to cheat up against that edge, you can change the angle just a little bit. But I want to just keep pulling that down and pulling that down and pulling that down, because I want that to look grimy. Now, once I start getting it like I want, then I start going in and I bounce my brush around a little bit. And that introduces a little bit of randomness. Now, I'll get a spot or two of oil and I'll just pull it down like that. You can do 1, you can do 2, you can do 5, totally up to you. Now I'll get my oils again, or my other brush. I'll damp it, and I'll just blend that just a little. And how much you blend it, again, completely up to you. We'll do the Bob Ross thing. We'll call them happy little oil streaks instead of happy little trees. And then you can start feathering the edge and pulling and pushing to get the oil to look just like you want. It's very, I've said it, you know, I want to sound like a broken record, but it's very, very workable. And when you hit that point that looks about right to you, you go, yeah, that's what I'm looking for. And that's about what I'm looking for right there. One thing I just realized I meant to do before I started the various staining and creating volume was I wanted to do a bit of a dot filter application on some of these larger expanses of white, just to kind of break them up a bit. So I'm only actually using 2 colors for this. With white, you have to be careful. If you know, on sometimes you'll see, and I've done it, you use blues and greens and yellows and all sorts of colors. But against white, that can start looking very cartoonish real quick, because all I'm really wanting is just some difference, very, very subtle difference. So I'm going to use medium gray and buff. Now, these are fairly light colors, and they'll give me a little bit of variation, but nothing too stark. Now, I've got a little bit on my palette here. And what I'm going to do is just apply some dots randomly. Actually, I've realized I'm not able to do random. My mind just doesn't do it. I keep going and eventually I see a pattern. But anyway, you get them as random as you want. And I'll get them applied on there like this. These aren't thinned. These are just straight from the tube. The more dots you put, the more tonal variation you get. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to take this dry, flat brush, just like that, and I'm just going to pull them down. Now when you get to this point, you're going to look at it and go, oh my gosh, that looks horrible. But you keep pulling. You just keep working it. You blend it like that. If you find areas that are getting, some areas that are getting too, or hard to work, get a separate, smaller brush and damp it with just the least hint of odorless thinner. And just move that one little spot, let it dry for a minute or two, and then go back and do it again. But what I've done is I've created some variation there. You can see I did this one earlier also. And you can go back and adjust it as many times as you want. You'll notice they're a little different. This one's a little whiter than this one. This one's a little dirtier. That's fine. I mean, that's some good random weathering. One thing to note on this one, I did it a little faster. The faster you do your streaks, the more they're going to muddy together and blend up. I did this one off camera, and I did it a little slower, and it's a little more streaky looking. So whatever effect you want, just pay attention to how you're pulling that down. If you're doing it really fast, like I was doing there, you get a little more of a blended effect. If you do it slower, you get more of a streaked effect. But I'm going to go through now on the rest of the model and do the dot filters, and then adding the volumes and the streaks and the stains and so forth. And once I'm done with that, it's going to be pretty close to being done. We'll just have a few final adjustment steps. Okay, I've got everything stained and streaked and dot filtered and quite a few other things that I did. It took several hours to get it all done because there's a lot of surfaces or facets to the model. But you can see I tried to give it some staining at various vents and around the tops of the legs and these vents here. I didn't go too heavy on the chipping. I was worried that I had done far too much. But after I put on the stains and things like that, I think it's at an appropriate level. At least I'd like to think so. The staining, I hadn't planned. Oh, I need to add some right there. I hadn't planned on doing quite this much, but I think it works. I'm happy with it. By putting it together like this, I can kind of evaluate the model for, does it need any more, like I just noticed on the back there. So putting it together allows me to kind of see it as a whole, and things are still reachable. The final step that I'm going to do, and unfortunately I'm going to have to do it off camera because of the logistics of getting everything together, I'm just going to do some airbrushing of a mix of 2 parts Tamiya NATO black and 1 part whole red, heavily thinned. I'm going to do that on a few areas just to introduce some suggestion of exhaust staining and things like that, and then a little bit of deck tan along the lower feet here just to give some suggestion of it being dirty, walking around and things like that. So I'll get that done and get this snapped onto the back, and I think I'm ready to call this guy done. Okay, I think I'm going to call this guy done. The staining that I added is, you can see it most prominently right here. Just some vent kind of staining a little bit here. I added a couple of little touches, very minor in a few places. And then I did a little bit of staining, a little dust along the bottom of the feet. Not much, just a little bit to give that area some warmth, I guess you'd say. And I really enjoyed building this kit. As I've mentioned, I'm pretty sure throughout this series of videos. These 1/100 scale Iron-Blooded Orphans kits are, even if they're not my favorite designs, they're absolutely my favorite kits in terms of Gunpla, because there's so much to like about them. The inner frame is detailed, yet not so fiddly to cause paratrooper words to be omitted. The external armor can almost all be applied after the frame is completely assembled, which makes painting and working with the model very easy. The designs, the biggest thing I don't like about the designs, quite honestly, is the feet. They just look kind of goofy to me. The rest of it, I think, looks pretty good, but there's a great variety of them. You'll see more on the blog or in video from me. Trust me, I've already got some in the stash ready to build. So this, the Barbatos, the Grays custom. There's a whole line of them, and they're all very cool. So I would highly recommend you checking them out if you're looking to build a very interesting and satisfying Gunpla. Okay, with all that being said, that's going to wrap up this video and this series. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being a patron. My family and I are most grateful for it, and I hope you're enjoying these build series, and that you're getting something out of them, and that it's helping you, or if it's not helping you in your modeling work, that it's at least entertaining you when you're watching them. So thank you again for being a patron. It really does mean a lot to me. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.